and as a real leader and founder of thought in so many aspects of reproductive medicine. And he's had an illustrious career, where I knew you, and I actually interviewed with you for fellowship at the University of Maryland in 1991. Where Dr. Adachi was chair, and then went for a time to University of Utah and was chair. And the last time spent in Providence and a dean of the School of Medicine at Brown, but has touched so many of our lives throughout the country and the world in reproductive medicine, and walked side by side and hand in mind with Howard Jones and the Norfolk folks in really inventing IVF, and there from the very, very early days. And his relationship with Dr. Howard, I know, was very close, with phone calls and visitation and thought leadership. And so I'm thrilled to hear your talk today on the history of IVF from the beginning. And today, we take advantage of how successful IVF is, and can say that, if you're 35 or under and have a good AMH, well, your odds in this program of having a baby with your first cycle of IVF is 70%, right? I mean, that's what our statistics show. But back in the early days, women went through 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 rounds of IVF with laparoscopic egg retrievals, and are really the unsung heroes in our field. But folks like Dr. Adachi and Howard Jones had the tenacity to continue with the vision of making this possible. And we're so privileged to have you today here with us. So thank you.
Delighted. So just proceed from here, is okay? I'll begin by saying that I'm emotional from a number of points of view. Most of you probably don't know, but I applied or interviewed for a job here in 1980. Dan Riddick was division director. Bletchner was chair. I didn't end up here, but I thought that Farmington was pretty even then. Never forgot that. And since that time, as some of you know, I visited here several times during Dr. Nelson's tenure. And Dr. Bletchner showed up for every single one of those lectures. So with respect to Dr. Bletchner, you know obviously everything. With respect to Dr. Riddick, he's alive and well. Dan is originally from Southern Virginia, but did his undergraduate medical school and residency at Duke University, not even under Chuck Hammond, but under his predecessor. And then to top it all off, he earned a PhD, I think, from Georgetown. If I'm not mistaken, there he is. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
And as I said, he earned a PhD probably at Georgetown. And to my knowledge, he is an ordained Protestant minister. I speak with him frequently on the phone. To this day, I mentioned to him that I was going to be here. I reminded him that I interviewed with him in 1980. You may have missed that. But I interviewed with Dan Riddick in 1980 here. um, with Lechner as the chair already at the time. So there are a lot of, shall we say, ends that come together with this and other stories, for which I, for the most part, was an observer. I don't want to take any credit for the development of the discipline, but by dint of my close and warm relationship with both Dr. Howard and Georgiana and their children, and my chairing the foundation in their name today, I obviously feel very attached to their name and thereby to their accomplishments and to, among other things, the founding of IVF. And so I'll try to do as much justice as I can to this as an observer, because I was not part of it, nor was I a contributor to it. But I was observing it very closely and talking to them on the phone repeatedly. With Howard, I had a scheduled phone call every 2 weeks. His secretary saw to that. And I stayed with him to the very end. He happened to have been my father's age, although he lived far longer. He was born in 1910 and died in 2005 at the age of 105. Quite compromised from a variety of points of view, not mentally, but physically. Georgiana having been lost a few years earlier due to a variety of issues, including central nervous system issues. I mentioned briefly to Dan that their oldest son, Howard Jr., passed away unexpectedly in his sleep this year, I think, not too long ago. He was the chair of OBGYN at Vanderbilt. He was a GYN oncologist. And I visited with him on a number of occasions. And as I mentioned to Dan, in those days, and I apologize for reminiscing, Howard Jr. did his residency training in OBGYN in Denver, Colorado. And when he got time off, and he came to Baltimore, and I was a fellow at the time, he would scrub in on the cases. Howard simply would include him in the mix. Nothing that would have been possible today, privileges-wise and otherwise. But father-son relationship and great deal of influence, of course, on the part of Howard Jones. So nobody thought anything of the fact that here was somebody who wasn't a fellow, who was actually a resident at the time, who was the son of Howard Jones. So he ended up participating. Well, I digress, of course, but I can't help it. This is a rather historic kind of a situation. So we'll talk today about the birth of Elizabeth Jordan Carr, who ultimately was born on December the 28th, 1981, so approximately 3 years after Louise Brown. So this, of course, was the first American IVF baby that graced every news outlet in the country, whether it was the Boston Globe or even Life magazine. This is an early photograph of the Carr baby. But what many people don't know that there was an earlier American side to this story when a young Bob Edwards actually came to Baltimore to work with Howard and Georgiana Jones for a year. And he did that because he was seeking human oocytes that he could culture, mature, and fertilize in vitro. Something he evidently could not do in the UK. And the notion was that during the course of ovarian retrosection, of which Dr. Jones did a plenty, he would provide the guest with ovarian wedge resection material and thereby allow him to secure some oocytes he could work with. They ended up publishing a paper which also included, among others, Ted Baramke. I don't know if you knew the man. I did not know Roger Donahue. But Bob Edwards was first author of that paper in 1966, and they talked about preliminary attempts to fertilize human oocytes matured in vitro because they were not convinced of their success. But when you revisit some of the photographs in those in that paper, some of the experts, not myself, but experts in embryology tell me that they may in fact have been more successful than they thought they were, and that maybe they did successfully fertilize some human oocytes in vitro. I first encountered Howard and Georgiana Jones as a fellow. This is a photograph, believe it or not, from 1977. Depressing. My co-fellows, whom you know well, included Zev Rosenwax, who is now at Cornell, of course, and John Rock, who was at one point in...
That's an amazing picture. It really is.
Remained at Hopkins for a while and then moved around. Ultimately became dean of a medical school in Florida. He's presently doing something along the educational lines in Saudi Arabia, I believe. In other words, he's not retired. And nor is Zev, who is still actively engaged at Cornell. So that was the last set of fellows of the Joneses. And their last year at Johns Hopkins before they moved to Norfolk. So in July of 1978, they marked 35 years of service to Johns Hopkins, and after which they declared that they will retire. And you know the rest of the story. And so they said goodbye, Hopkins, and they ended up moving to Norfolk, where the chair of the department was a certain Mason Andrews, who was a former resident at Hopkins and a former trainee of the Joneses and a friend of them as well. And so they felt they were going to, quote unquote, retire, but in a friendly context. But as you know, something happened on the way to Norfolk. And that happened on July the 25th, 1978. And of course, was the birth of Louise Brown, who is shown here in the arms of her mother, Leslie, on the front page of Time magazine. And so...
And then we came to Norfolk.
That's what
And
they had
that
to say.
happened to be the birthday of Louise Brown.
The story captured the world's headlines, and the Joneses had a link with the British team of Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards. Edwards had worked with them at Baltimore. A Norfolk reporter wanted to talk about it.
She came to our home as the man was moving in the boxes and the furniture, and we had an interview sitting on the boxes. And as she finished the interview, she asked us, could this be done in Norfolk? And we thought it was almost a joke, and we said, why, certainly. And she said, what would it take? And we said, a little money.
What happened?
A most extraordinary thing. Georgiana had had a patient from Norfolk who had come to Baltimore with infertility. She was fortunate to have a child subsequent to that, and she called up Georgiana.
She said, Dr. Jones, I understand that Dr. Howard says that it will only take a little bit of money to bring a test tube baby clinic to Norfolk. And my family has a foundation which we would love to donate.
It's amazing.
So
They were my attendants, Howard and Georgiana, when I was a fellow.
That's amazing.
So that began the Norfolk story. Now, it wasn't smooth sailing. In those days, you had to secure what was known as a certificate of need to be able to carry on, particularly a new procedure in a medical context. And because the pro-life, pro-choice debate is as old as humanity, I suppose, it also raged in Norfolk in the context of the plan to perform IVF. And so the Joneses had to deal with the Eastern Virginia Health System Agency and the Norfolk General Hospital to secure this certificate. And what ensued was a battle royale between the pro-life and pro-choice constituencies in the region. This is a clip from November 1979 of Dr. Jones making the case for IVF. But as you can see from the title, both sides swap barbs over test tube babies. This wasn't happening naturally and smoothly. On the pro-life side, the opposition was led by a certain Charles Dean Jr., who was president of the Tidewater chapter of the Virginia Society for Human Life. On the pro-choice side, the Joneses recruited an old friend, Roy Parker, former chair of OBGYN at Duke University, and then president of ACO, as well as Professor John Biggers, PhD from Harvard University, well-known expert in egg physiology and fertilization, and also the Right Reverend Heath Light and Rabbi Lawrence Foreman. They all represented the pro-choice side of the debate. To make a long story short, after an unpleasant period of disagreements and worse, a certificate of need was ultimately granted. And so a team was assembled. Mason Andrews, as I mentioned, was the chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the time at Norfolk. Jairo Garcia, as you know, was a former fellow of Howard and Georgiana Jones, and he joined the team. Dr. Jones, Dr. Georgiana Jones, and Anibal Acosta who happened to already be in Providence, not in Providence, in Norfolk, in a different hospital. And he too was a former fellow of Howard and Georgiana, and we're talking years ago. And last but hardly least, Lucinda Wigg, who was the embryologist, who ultimately, as you know, moved to Cornell, but at the time was central to the efforts in Norfolk. Now, the early record was hardly promising. They did 41 natural IVF cycles with embryo transfer and 12 Pergonal-stimulated IVF cycles with embryo transfer, 53 attempts in all, but no pregnancies. Enter Judith and Roger Carr. And Roger, I might add, with more than a touch of sadness, also passed away too young. But you will see an interview I did with Judith, who is still alive and well. Now, her retrieval took place on April the 21st, 1981, and led to embryo transfer on the 27th. Mind you, of course, all of this was done laparoscopically. And a positive pregnancy test was documented on May the 7th, 1981. For reasons that had everything to do with the desire to not take any chances, I suppose, Elizabeth Carr was delivered by cesarean section. And I think there is a small video that follows that depicts the event in real time.
Elizabeth, Jordan, Carr.
She looks good?
No, she is really a lovely baby.
She's
strong and healthy.
that's all I wanted to hear. Oh boy. No, I like your hat. Hello.
Beautiful.
She's something else. Well, you don't look too thrilled with life there.
Oh, she's doing great. She really is.
Hello. Hello. She is kind of tiny though, isn't she?
She looks well nourished. You can tell by the skin, the quality of the skin, and the thickness of the skin fold.
Well, we'll let her go back to sleep. I think so. Oh dear.
Cut this one. Cut the show.
Okay.
Amazing footage. I know, I'm thinking like that. I love your they have that footage.
Yeah.
I noticed. Right, and Georgiana was in the delivery.
Was she a blastocyst transfer?
Right, and it was a 6-day transfer.
Was it blastocyst transfer?
Yeah.
Blastocyst?
I'm actually not sure.
It sounds like
The
from
dates,
face.
it was 6 days after the retrieval.
Yeah.
Pioneers.
So in the aftermath of all of this, in a manner not unlike the Joneses, they declared Elizabeth Jordan Carr their first IVF granddaughter. And as I mentioned to you, they had, of course, 2 children of their own, but this was the first IVF granddaughter. I met Judy on a board that she sat on. This was the board of the Bertarelli Foundation, which regularly met in Switzerland. And that's where my wife and I have gotten to know her as a person. I really didn't know her before. But on the date listed here, I interviewed Judy as to her experience, her recollections, and I think this is the tape, the videotape which follows. It is really good to see you again, Judy, and to have this opportunity to revisit what happened now 40 years ago. So thinking back to 1981, what were the circumstances that led you to seek out the Norfolk IVF program? And how did you find out about it in the first place?
Well, in 1981, unfortunately, I suffered my third ectopic pregnancy. And after that, I was speaking with the doctor, and he said, well, I don't know if this makes any sense whatsoever, but he had just returned from a conference in Williamsburg where he heard both Dr. Jones speak on IVF. And the doctor said to me, I have no idea. I don't understand anything about this, but you might be interested.
Were you aware of the fact at the time that the Norfolk program had yet to give rise to an IVF baby at that time? And if so, would that really have mattered to the extent that you can speculate on that?
I had absolutely no idea that they did not have a success. I just assumed that they had, certainly because Louise Brown had been born in England, and I knew there had been some other pregnancies. So I just assumed that this was the case for me. When my husband and I discussed it, and we didn't know, and they didn't tell us, we had decided that we had been given this opportunity to do this as a possibility. And we decided that we didn't want to be 40 years old and looking back and saying, I wish we had done this. And it wouldn't have mattered to us at all.
What do you recall of your first encounter with the Norfolk IVF team? You, after all, did not know any of the actors, did you?
Absolutely not. We were coming from Massachusetts, where this technology was still illegal to even investigate at all of the Massachusetts hospitals. The district attorney in Boston had said this was experimentation on an embryo, and that was not allowed. So we headed to Norfolk after having some phone conversations, and we walked into the Norfolk Clinic, which was at Norfolk Medical School. And the minute I opened the door and walked in, I felt incredibly comfortable and said, we're in the right place. Everyone from the reception to Dr. Garcia and the Doctors Jones, Dr. Costa, everyone we met, we knew we felt very, very comfortable.
I'm hardly surprised, but it's a memory and recollection that only you can share. What is your most vivid recollection of your Norfolk experience, if we can call it that, culminating in the eventual delivery of Elizabeth by cesarean section?
Well, I have several vivid memories. All of them were just so wonderful and such a joy at the time. But one of the things that I found remarkable, when I became pregnant with Elizabeth, Dr. Howard Jones found out that I was taking the airport limousine to the hotel and to the clinic. And after he found that out, he decided that he would become the new limousine driver. And he picked me up every time I flew into Norfolk for an appointment. And it's during that time that he and I would have conversations that we really got to understand each other. I got to understand the importance of all this, which I really didn't understand before, and more about them and the protocols and all of that. And Dr. Jones got to know more about me. And I thought that was a remarkable experience. The other experience that I obviously cannot forget before the birth of Elizabeth was the fact that my egg had fertilized and that they were transferring it on my birthday on April 17th. Amazing.
All kinds of amazing coincidences here with critical dates.
Yes.
What might you wish to say to the physicians who make up our audience today, who are practicing IVF 40 years later as a matter of course, some of whom are probably too young to have recalled what we at least experienced in real time?
Well, it's important for doctors to know, and I receive this information because I talk to current patients often. And one of the things that comes to mind, and I think it's very important for doctors to understand, that each patient, even though there's incredible standard protocols and there's cryopreservation and all these wonderful technologies, that the doctors need to not lose sight of each individual patient, because there is room for flexibility. And as I said, each patient needs to feel like the doctor knows them. And that's that matter of rapport and trust. And if that doesn't happen, the successes probably aren't as great.
Well, very well said. And of course, spoken by somebody who has witnessed it all firsthand. Judy, I can't tell you how delighted I am that we had this opportunity, how privileged I feel to have known you and to be in a position to revisit these momentous events. Thank you very much. So there you have it. Stay tuned.
Amazing.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I know. And the more I think about it, the more I look at it, I myself am speechless. Yeah. Tenacity and persistence. Now, of course, there was a precedent which was helpful, but still, what can you say? These were special people.
Guys we train now, they don't appreciate it, I don't think. Right? Well, we take it for granted. Right. We really take it for granted. There's been, we now know that there's been 10 million IVF babies. And this was, the first baby in Australia may have predated this, right? So this was
the American baby, yeah.
So the American baby was, I mean, I don't know where we were in the world.
I'll say something about this.
But it was not many, right?
No, but I think you're historically probably right, although I'll have to look into it. But the Australians were clearly, on top of it. Israelis were on top of it. There were a variety of groups that were really pushing. But I'll share an anecdote with you. The chair of the Australian department, and I wish I could remember his name, came to San Diego when I was a fellow there after Hopkins, and described to Sam Yan and to Bob Jaffe, who was in town, their latest IVF successes. And I was a lowly fellow. I was just listening respectfully on the sideline. But I noticed that when they were left alone after the Australian gentleman left, one of them, and I think it may have been Bob, said, "This is a passing fancy. This is not going to take off or become anything of consequence. And I could never forget that. I was a close friend of Bob Jaffin, stayed with him at his home, and on many occasions consulted him during my career. But the notion that IVF will produce the millions of babies that it did, and that it will be a major solution to infertility, at the time did not sink in. Sam Yen was trained in various places, but among others at Hopkins. And he knew the Jones, and he believed in the surgical approach. And so it's not completely unexpected, but in hindsight, somewhat stunning. But that's not to say that we would have been any better and or would have seen and accepted change at the time that we are referring to. So I don't mean to be critical. I just wish to share what I think is an interesting historical anecdote by two very bright individuals, but whose focus was medical endocrinology, you know. And I could go on, but I should probably stop there.
What did you think about, I'm sure you read it, David Brooks' editorial this weekend in the New York Times about IVF?
No, I didn't see that. Is that about the congressional debate?
He was very negative.
Really?
About the future of IVF.
Really?
Yeah.
I should read that.
Yeah. In terms of, did you read it?
Yeah, I did read it.
In terms of,
if somebody could print it, I'd appreciate it.
Designer babies.
We no longer.
I can email it. I can't print
We
it.
no longer subscribe to the New York Times.
It was really interesting.
It was.
He was very negative, right?
Right. It was about selecting particular gametes, creating, I think also creating like cloning, basically.
Right, right.
I'm
Right.
surprised.
Designer babies.
I'm surprised he would even wade into this
I know,
arena.
it was interesting, very negative.
It was very negative.
He's a Republican.
No, very. I was surprised.
But I think Jewish. I don't think he's too preoccupied with the pro-life issue.
No.
So I don't really know what to say. Interesting. I never thought he would have waded into this area. This is so far from what he does.
Right.
If you told me he was weighing in on the likelihood that the bill will pass,
You should send it to him.
Yeah.
yeah,
right.
if you could, I'd appreciate
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
sure.
Sure, yes, it was. Is he referring to the PGTP for polygenic disorders?
Yeah, he was
Commercial,
talking about,
it's becoming an industry,
yeah, kind of making the perfect baby.
Right.
selecting for traits.
So selecting traits, really, that's really, I think, what it was about, like particular traits and
But he was very negative.
not just being disease-free, but being, perfect.
That's a long ways where we came from. Right? I mean, when Claudio and I were at Penn, it was like a major celebration if you had a pregnancy, right?
Wow.
It was like, wow.
And now patients demand, how come it didn't work?
Right.
Transfer it,
Google it up.
PGT, tested them, healthy embryo.
Right.
How come it didn't work? Well, it's not 100%.
Right.
Well, I think we can safely say that we witnessed history in the making, and maybe 50 years from now, it will be of limited relevance,
But we won't be here.
And we won't be here, that's what I meant. But as I mentioned, as I say tomorrow, in theory, in vitro gametogenesis, once it is fully materialized and approved, could in principle substitute for IVF as we know it.
Now that's when it was points that, females could have
You're
children,
adopted.
without,
Yes.
males could have children without a female. So, you could create gametes and you don't need a male or you don't need a female.
This was in Brooks's article?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and as you know, I mean, this has been extended to same-sex couples now. The Nature paper on the pregnancy, 2 men who were subjected to a certain procedure and gave rise to a pregnancy, which required the surrogate, of course, to carry. But 2 men and 2 women can now, in principle, once the technology is perfected in human, and it hasn't been, and once it's FDA approved, in principle, could have genetically related children.
Right.
And that's a huge departure from how we grew up, what our expectations were. So one thing sort of builds on another. And we were, all of us, witnesses, active or passive, to what transpires in reproduction, which is unprecedented, of course. So I'm glad we had a chance to cover some of that history, which will in time be forgotten. So we had an opportunity to.
It's crazy.
To refresh our memories.
Very privileged.
Yeah.
Speaking about history, made me think of a question. You mentioned 2 bright individuals, Ian and Jaffe, who really wrote the textbook that everybody until now, utilizes. And I know another 2 bright individuals who wrote, in my opinion, a better textbook, Adachi and Rosenbachs, who I thought was a wonderful book. In fact, I prepared my own with the textbook. How come it has not been updated? It's only one.
I mean,
that could be your next.
You put out an article or 2 once a month, so how come you can't update the text?
I know.
So one, to me, it was the best book.
Thank you.
To prepare for boards.
Thank you so much. But it was a bit different. When it was time to update it, probably it was a different time in our collective lives. I can't put a year on it, but what you're referring to is occurring at a point in time when I'm a tenured professor with no real obligations, although I teach medical students and I work with medical students to write papers and things. But I no longer have a full-time job.
Right.
At the time, I think we simply got caught up in the stream of life and we were content to let it be. In addition, the division of labor at the time was not entirely equitable. And I think some of us didn't want to revisit that. So the book adorns one of my shelves, but
mine too.
I don't think it will
I
be,
have it at home.
I don't think it'll be
It was
really.
1992, 2-volume or something, right?
Yeah.
I got it as a graduation gift from this fellowship.
Oh, you did? Oh,
Thank you, gave it to me.
you fell on it. That was so good.
Amazing.
It's crazy.
So, well, yeah, I don't know.
There's a message.
So, you know, in terms of, we have a number of people on the line here, and are there questions from the First Fertility Network that you would like to ask Dr. Adachi?
Here's a question.
Assuming he knows
just
the
a second.
answer.
Dr. Clipstein says, pleasure to hear your wisdom and benefit from your lived experience. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Answer, and who is that?
Sigal Clipstein?
Oh, really? How come she's on this?
So she's now,
in
her
Chicago.
practice in Chicago
Hi,
is
Dr.
part of our
Adachi.
network. Hello, Sigal.
She's there?
I'm here. Oh, here. You should hear. Hold on. Yes. Hi.
Yeah.
Can you see me?
How are you
Hi.
doing?
I'm good. How are you? I'm part of the
Good.
family, so you know.
You want to practice your Hebrew?
Yes. We can do that. We can see who understands us. Probably half of you. Yes.
I speak with Sigal every few weeks or thereabouts. But she spent, I think, 2 or 3 years with Dr. Penzias, who is still failing his Hebrew test mightily. So I keep asking her, what in the world was she doing all that time?
I know. I was learning from him and not the other way around. What was I thinking? But listen, Dr. Dashi, maybe it's you know, your next job is to teach the world Hebrew.
I speak with Alan also quite regularly, sometimes with his wife.
Lots of happy families.
Yeah. And we're giving this, I think, talk at the Brigham and Women Hospital soon, and some other hospitals in Tufts, which is where I trained in Boston, things of that sort. So yeah, small community. We're all somehow connected. I didn't realize Sigal was on the line.
And maybe some other people.
There are some. So they're part of the same network of practices that we're in.
That's
That's why
wonderful.
she's here.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad. That expands the circle.
Yeah.
I mean, when Dr. Nelson would invite me, and I was here at least 2 or 3 times during your tenure.
Yeah.
And we would congregate around the table, but it was a small group always, right? Just our guys.
Right. And now it's much bigger.
Now it's a national thing.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Amazing.
All right, well, thank you everyone for your attendance. And for those on the line, you may remember we have another lecture tomorrow evening. I believe that's at 5:30 with Dr. Kutlak Aktay will be joining us for a virtual talk. So whoever wants to join us, we'll be looking forward to that. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming.
My distinct pleasure. I always felt my visits to Farmington were rewarding and pleasant. And I keep saying that Farmington is also a very pretty locale.
Very.
And I discovered this, as I mentioned, in 1980 when I interviewed here with Dan Riddick and Lechner.
So I guess we'll just officially end the meeting. I don't know who has got the power to do that, and
You do.
we'll head to dinner.
Sounds good. Sounds good.